Bravo, bravo, Daniel. I must applaud you on that one. With the is metaphysics unfalsifiable. I think my favorite line here is it might be the case that everything falsifiable is objective based, but it doesn't have to be the case that everything objective based must be falsifiable. Bravo, bravo. I was just, I'm not sure how much I can contribute to the process of this, but you address everything that I was already thinking of in terms of fundamentals, right? What do we mean by falsifiable, right? What do we mean by this? And just add another question is like, what do we mean by evidence, right? What do we mean by this is the evidence that it can be falsifiable? This is the evidence that it can be unfalsifiable, and so on. And I'm really glad you addressed the whole, how would it be if I were to interact with this pile of rubble, which knowing prior used to be a bridge, and I knew this fact, right? And I could look at this pile of bricks and rubble and be like, well, this clearly used to be a bridge, and so I can see the lack within that. But again, you brought that wonderful example, and I was already thinking it while I was reading it. So it was great that you actually said it, because if not, I was gonna bring that thought experiment in, where we're thinking about like, okay, well, we're presupposing that one has already seen the bridge. So now let's presuppose someone that has never seen a bridge, right? And presuppose someone never seeing a pile of rubble, right? Where would they understand the lacks, right? The thing would just be as it is, right? Now, so what's interesting that's kind of begging question in my mind is typically the way I understand metaphysics, right? Is that we're trying to understand the metaphysics is basically trying to understand the structure of reality, right? Now, we've typically based our structure of reality on, physical structures, right? And we call these sort of objective observances, right? But I think when we're dealing with metaphysics, right, we can't presuppose constantly, and this is not a critique on your paper, I'm just kind of adding things, because I don't really have anything to critique. I actually fully, I'm definitely convinced in terms of the thing, because I thought the way you reversed the whole, it might be the case that everything is falsifiable, that everything is falsifiable in the object base and so on. But anyways, nonetheless, I digress. What I'm trying to say is this structure of reality that we're trying to understand. It is like trying to pin down like a superstructure, right? A superstructure, a structure beyond structures that we are not particularly used to, right? So I think some of the problems against what we call unfalsifiable is imposing some kind of regiment of familiar structure, but just because that's a familiar structure of reality does not, it doesn't presuppose that it's the correct criteria to impose upon what we call objective-based reality and so on. So that was a couple of things that came to my head about that this kind of figure out what's the structure of reality. I think what's interesting here is what there's a thing that came to my mind was that why are certain things falsifiable and certain things unfalsifiable, right? That says something about the structure of reality itself, doesn't it? One, because it starts to ring that same common quote from Heraclitus where he says that nature likes to hide itself, right? So I found myself in this interesting thinking about we can't just be dismissive about things unfalsifiable, but rather how can we connect what is unfalsifiable with things that are falsifiable, right? What is the thread? What is the thread between things that have what we call unfalsifiable and falsifiable things? And what are the threads between objective and, what is it you called it? Non-person interchangeable, something like that? Yeah, was it non-person interchangeable and then person interchangeable? What are the threads between those, right? Because if we can make the threads between all of those, right, we can begin to make a perimeter around the structure of reality, the structure of the metaphysics that we're talking about here, right? Look at the lacks between the falsifiable and the unfalsifiable. Look between the lacks between the no one person exchange and the interperson exchange. I think this might prove to be a useful and provocative thinking, something to think about, something to, dwell in. I'm glad I read this paper, and yes, I hope you will enjoy my ponderings on this subject as well. All right, take care.
It's very kind of you to give that a read, Javier, and thank you for your wonderful reply. I think you're exactly right. When we start to say, what is the nature, ask this question, what is the nature of reality that makes some things falsifiable and not others? How do we connect? What is the thread between the falsifiable and the unfalsifiable? And this very good question, what is the thread between the non-personal and personal? What is the thread between something that any given person would experience and what only a particular kind of person could experience? What's very interesting is that when Jockin is saying that there's a sense in which metaphysics is falsifiable, that's exactly right. It is indeed falsifiable to the engineer that this bridge is no longer a bridge. But traditionally speaking, following the philosophy of science, something cannot be falsifiable unless the observer is interchangeable. Which, you see, this just begins to suggest that maybe we're lacking a category. There's a paper we did where we talk about inanimate objects, animate objects, and then parentheses inanimate objects. You see, the problem is the majority of what we in modern civilization is surrounded by is actually not inanimate objects. Like, take a laptop. Is a laptop really an inanimate object like a stone? Well, they're both not animated, and yet the laptop would not exist without the existence of the mind, a human mind, to create it, something animated. And you see, very problematically, we just treat laptops and bookcases and rocks all as equally inanimate, so we divide the world between animate and inanimate objects. Excuse me. And you see, this is where Derrida can be quite useful. If I'm on, it's Sunday, so I'm going to be nice to Derrida. Monday I'll be mean to him. I've got different days of the weeks. So Derrida's like, you got to break down these dichotomies because often it captures thinking, and he's correct. So we think inanimate and animate, but there actually needs to be a third category, and that is an object that is not animate, but that would not exist as itself, as we currently understand it, without the existence of minds. There would not be any laptops if there were no human minds, but there would probably be rocks. And so, considering that, it seems kind of silly to refer to rocks and laptops as equivalent in their ontology. So we need a third category. We just call it in the Reconstructing ASA the in parentheses animate. So it's inanimate. It is something. The potentiality is found in that which is animated, human minds, but it is not in of itself an animated thing. And maybe you see this category of objects, of entities, of things, might be the foundation for perhaps we need to describe falsifiable entities, unfalsifiable entities, and then unfalsifiable entities with the UN in parentheses. And maybe this is the third category that we need, because it would seem to be what connects the falsifiable and the unfalsifiable is some sort of personal dimension. And then there seems to be these between entities that are both falsifiable in one sense and unfalsifiable in another. So what's interesting to me is that there's a very real sense, just like Jockin says, that the pile of debris is objectively in its objectness lacking the bridge, and yet it does not match the, it will not be unfalsifiable as understood by traditionally as the philosophy of science. So what's going on? Again, it seems to be that there is a third category that is missing, and arguably so much of what metaphysics is trying to get at are these between entities. It's almost like you want to call it, instead of metaphysics, it's almost like between physics, some sort of word that means between, mid-physics, mid-physical, metaphysical, between physical. It's a betweenness that good metaphysics is trying to do. What lacks are between, they're between presence and nothing. And unfortunately, perhaps what has hurt our metaphysical understandings of the world is it's so influenced by Descartes, which makes it other. Metaphysics is other than physical, as opposed to being this thing that's perhaps other dimensional, like this another dimension of human being and existence in the world. And so perhaps that has contributed, this dualism, this Platonism that's hanging over our understanding of metaphysics. And I do think exactly what you're saying. I mean, arguably now they're starting to realize that falsification isn't going to cut it when you start getting into M theory. There's this huge debate now that falsification needs to be thrown out, but then they're like, oh my gosh, what do we have? If we don't have falsification, what do we have? And likewise, it would seem that just breaking the world up into animate and inanimate objects is inadequate. You need a third category, as it would seem to break the world up between the falsifiable and the unfalsifiable seems inadequate. So what's curious, and maybe something should be added to the short work, maybe I probably will, something where it suggests that maybe what we need is perhaps the debris, even though it would not, the pile of debris is not a word, but, it's spelled like that, and I'm awake and it's late. Debris, maybe the pile of debris that is lacking the bridge, because it is in fact in its objectness lacking a bridge relative to the engineer and people that used it, but not to the wolf boy in the forest. Maybe then that is an example of something that is unfalsifiable with the UN in parentheses. Maybe that's the third category that we would need, because it is falsifiable but conditionally falsifiable. And perhaps that's, I guess that's the problem is in philosophy of science, we don't have conditional falsification. We only have general or universal falsification. And it would seem that what we're getting at is the inadequacy of only having those two options.
Wonderful. So conditional falsifiable. I like that, because we are always, you're right, we're always trying to aim for a universal falsifiable, but that presupposes that universal falsifiable is superior than the conditional falsifiable. And it kind of just, it kind of reminds me again, like, it kind of reminds me again, it's like, when we say something is conditional falsifiable and universal falsifiable, it makes me wonder about this thing about, when we call something universal falsifiable, it seems like we create the conditions to make it universal falsifiable, where when we call something conditional falsifiable, it actually demands its own conditions, possibly. Just to give like those right, like your talk on beauty, right? Where we're talking about beauty has its own conditions, right? And I think that a good question is like, okay, when we talk about metaphysics, what is it that metaphysics demands as a conditions rather than what we demand of metaphysics, right? Because it seems like we're always stuck in that sort of logic of what are we demanding of metaphysics, but we're always presupposing that we have a level of insight to demand from metaphysics, to demand from the structure of reality, and so on. And And I think somehow we've kind of fooled ourselves with this universal falsifiable, where we've kind of created the conditions to make something that is universal falsifiable, and then somewhat put something that's conditional falsifiable in the background and on the wayside. It's kind of like, yeah, it is kind of like that argument that you were throwing in your paper, where it's like, the apologist was trying to say that if one person had experienced God, then so on. But I think a better way would have been to phrase what that person was saying. I'm talking about like the guy that actually said the argument, not how you put it. But it would be like, what conditions are being demanded, right? And I think that's why phenomenology is so freaking useful in this framework of thinking, because it's like, I shouldn't set the conditions, right? I shouldn't set the conditions, because then we run into these issues of falsifiable, unfalsifiable, and so on. And again, I think it's because we fool ourselves in thinking that we don't set the conditions, but we do set the conditions. And phenomenology is what really seems to be the one that you have to meet the conditions of the arising phenomena, right, in order to encounter the arising phenomena. So, these questions of what are the conditions that metaphysics demands of us? I think that's a good question that I'm thinking about. What are the conditions that metaphysics demands of us, rather than that what we demand of metaphysics? Because I think this whole idea of falsifiable, unfalsifiable, that's us demanding out of metaphysics, right? That's something self-constructed that we've demanded out of the metaphysics. But what does metaphysics demand out of us? Is it necessarily the conditions of falsifiable or unfalsifiable, right? Is it those conditions? What are those conditions, right? I'm basically kind of doing like the phenomenology of metaphysics, right? What is it that metaphysics is demanding of us in its arising and so on, which is a vicious cycle, because that's metaphysical. Anyways, and to go with your I really love the way you actually put that animate, inanimate thing, because I haven't really thought about it that way. Please send me that article. I would love to read that, actually. But yes, a third category, right? And I think that's so wonderful that you brought up this third category, right? Because it seems like a lot of people go into this error of like, well, if we can't fit it in, and here in this opposition, if we can't fit it in this space, and if we can't fit it in this space, then we can't work with it, right? But and we often dispose of it, and so on, or we wrongly put it in a space that it doesn't belong, right, or a category it doesn't belong in. And so I think that's wonderful that you talk about this like in-between category, right, in between the two, and so on, because yeah, just it makes sense. It honestly, it makes sense, because it's, we never think about why, when things don't make sense, right, for some reason we don't come up with the idea that possibly these are not the only two categories that exist, right? Or these are possibly not the only methods that exist, right? Because, and I think when we come into those issues of, well, I can't really prove that it's falsifiable and so on, it really begs the question of like, well, then what am I doing wrong here, right? There's something that's being done wrong in our thinking, in our methods, something like that. It's something that's being done wrong, and it obviously we're pushing the limits of something, but we often mistake it as, I guess we just sometimes rather not deal with it, and we just say, oh, it's unfalsifiable, so we can't deal with it, so it's just nonsensical and so on. And I think that's a little bit. I think that's taking it not seriously enough with things. So I think that was wonderful what you said about the inanimate, and the in between word. I'm sorry that I can't remember how it was phrased. I'm a very visual person in this regard. But yes, beautiful. I loved it. Take care.
The following is a section added to Is Metaphysics Unfalsifiable after listening and responding to Javier Rivera's points, starting now. Still, before closing, it should be noted that Javier Rivera posed some interesting questions and points regarding the subject. What is the nature of reality that makes some things falsifiable and not others? How can we connect the falsifiable with the unfalsifiable? What is person-dependent with from what is non-person dependent, to allude to Rauch? If we could determine this, we might be able to determine the perimeter around reality, which would help us understand metaphysics. Generally, it seems that metaphysical entities like lacks and beings exist in between spaces. Lacks are falsifiable in one sense, but not in another. Beauty is here in one sense, but also elsewhere. Form is present in matter, and yet at the same time can't be found in matter. Metaphysics are about these between things that entail a kind of both-ness. It's difficult to describe. Unfortunately, we often hear metaphysics and influenced by Plato think transcendent and or totally other from physicality. But lacks are not totally other from our lives. Thomas Jockin is correct that we experience and recognize them constantly. Through Nothing We Know by O.G. Rose argues that we often are lacking a third category, which we need to understand our world. We've had the categories of thing and nothing, but thoughts are more like no things with the no in parentheses, between thingness and non-thingness. We've had inanimate and animate objects, but laptops are more like inanimate objects with the in parentheses, because they would not exist without animated minds and so on. Regarding entities which fall under third categories like those described, categories like falsifiable and unfalsifiable don't readily apply, and perhaps even contribute to us missing the existence of the entities which fall under third categories we don't traditionally acknowledge. If we believe everything which exists is either falsifiable or unfalsifiable, for example, and if it is the case that lacks fall between these categories, then we will conclude lacks are nothing, but lacks very much exist, even if they aren't real like clouds. Perhaps the metaphysics of lacks brings to our attention the need for a third criteria like unfalsifiable with the UN in parentheses, which would suggest a conditional falsification. Relative to the designer of a bridge, those who used it, and the like, the idea that a pile of debris is in fact lacking bridgeness is very much falsifiable, though this lack wouldn't be falsifiable to a wolf boy per se. To say, therefore, that lacks are unfalsifiable is true relative to Karl Popper, but the statement also feels inadequate. It feels like we want to say that lacks are conditionally falsifiable. Is metaphysics unfalsifiable with the UN in parentheses? Is that the conclusion we should reach? Perhaps, but I will leave that thread to explore another time.